The first landing craft cut through the choppy waters of the English Channel. Like a knife through black silk, its hull trembling against the pre-dawn swells. Inside, 36 American soldiers of the 4th Infantry Division pressed together in the darkness, their faces pale green in the dim light, stomachs churning from more than just seasickness. Private First Class Robert Murphy clutched his rifle with white knuckles, listening to the distant thunder that wasn't thunder at all. It was the roar of Allied bombers, pounding the French coast ahead of them. At 0 for 30 hours on the morning of June 6, 1944, the largest seaborne invasion in human history was about to begin. The moon had set, leaving only stars to witness the armada of over 5,000 ships spread across the horizon. Like a steel constellation, Utah Beach, the westernmost landing zone of Operation Overlord, lay shrouded in morning mist just for miles ahead. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder stood in the command vessel, studying the dark coastline through his field glasses. The intelligence reports had been clear. Utah Beach was defended by the German 700 and 9th Static Infantry Division with concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, and thousands of obstacles designed to tear landing craft apart. Behind those defenses lay the flooded marshlands of the Cotentin Peninsula, deliberately inundated by the Germans to create an impassable barrier. It was a fortress that had taken the Wehrmacht for years to build. But Rudder knew something the Germans didn't. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had dropped behind enemy lines 3 hours earlier, their mission to secure the causeway exits and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beach. The paratroopers were scattered across Normandy in the darkness, fighting their own desperate battles to open the gates of Fortress Europe. As the landing craft approached the surf line, the naval bombardment reached its crescendo. Heat battleship USS Nevada, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, hurled 14-inch shells at the German positions with methodical precision. Each explosion lit the beach like daylight for a split second, revealing the skeletal remains of beach obstacles and the concrete teeth of Atlantic wall bunkers. According to Stephen Ambrose's definitive account in D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Utah Beach Assault Force consisted of 23,000 men carried in 865 landing craft of various types. Sergeant Thomas Mitchell, a veteran of the Sicily Campaign, moved among the younger soldiers in his landing craft. "Remember what we trained for, boys," he called over the engine noise. "Get off the beach fast. Don't bunch up. Keep moving inland. The beach is a killing ground. Our job is to get past it." The men of Company A, 1st Battalion, 8th Infantry Regiment had rehearsed this moment 100 times on the beaches of Devon and Dorset. They had practiced with live ammunition under fire, in conditions designed to be harder than the real thing. But nothing could truly prepare them for what lay ahead. As dawn broke over the Norman coast, the German defenders in their concrete bunkers strained to see through the smoke and spray. Obergefreiter Hans Weber peered through the firing slit of Wider Stansness 62, one of 15 strong points defending Utah Beach. He had been awake all night, listening to the rumble of aircraft overhead and watching the horizon light up with distant flashes. Now, as the mist began to clear, he could see them, hundreds of dark shapes cutting through the water toward his position. The landing craft engines roared as coxswains gunned them toward shore. In the lead boat, Captain Leonard Schroeder checked his watch, 0630 hours, each hour. Behind him, the second wave was already forming up, followed by tanks, artillery, and the thousands of men who would either secure a foothold in Nazi-occupied Europe or die trying. The steel dawn had come to Utah Beach, and nothing would ever be the same. The ramp dropped with a metallic clang that echoed like a death knell across the water. Sergeant First Class Theodore Roosevelt Jr., eldest son of the former president, stepped into knee-deep water under a sky already crisscrossed with tracer fire. At 57, he was the oldest man on Utah Beach that morning, walking with a cane due to arthritis. But his voice carried clear as a bell over the chaos. "We'll start the war from right here." The first wave of landing craft had come ashore at 0630 hours, but something was wrong. The beach didn't match their maps. The distinctive church spire that should have marked their position was nowhere to be seen. Strong currents had pushed them to 1,000 yards south of their intended landing zone. Instead of facing the heavily fortified positions they had trained to assault, they found themselves on a stretch of sand defended by only a handful of German bunkers. Private Murphy stumbled forward through the surf, his waterlogged equipment dragging him down. The water was shockingly cold, and the weight of his pack threatened to pull him under with each step. Around him, men cursed and shouted as they struggled toward the dunes. Machine gun fire cracked overhead, but it was sporadic, confused. The Germans had been caught as off guard by the misplaced landing as the Americans themselves. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Teague, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 8th Infantry, quickly assessed the situation. The error that had seemed like a disaster might actually be a blessing. This section of beach was more lightly defended, and the beach obstacles were fewer. "Push inland," he ordered. "We'll sort out our position once we're off this beach." The German resistance came in deadly bursts from Widerstandsness 5, a concrete bunker partially concealed by sand dunes. Unteroffizier Karl Wegner opened fire with his MG-40 machine gun. The weapon's distinctive sound described by Allied soldiers as Hitler's Zipper sent Americans diving for whatever cover they could find. But the bunker was isolated, cut off from supporting positions by the American landing. As detailed in Gordon Harrison's official U.S. Army History Cross-Channel Attack, the initial German response to the Utah landings was hampered by confusion over the exact location of the assault and the scattered nature of their coastal defenses. Captain George Mabry led his company across the beach in short rushes, using craters from the naval bombardment as cover. The months of training had become instinct. "Move, move, move," he shouted, his voice hoarse from salt spray and smoke behind him. Corporal James Blue dragged a wounded comrade toward the seawall, both men leaving dark trails in the sand. The second wave arrived at 0700 hours, bringing Sherman tanks of the 701st Tank Battalion. The DD tanks amphibious Shermans equipped with flotation screens churned through the surf, like prehistoric monsters emerging from the sea. Their 75mm guns began systematically destroying German strongpoints that had survived the naval bombardment. Tank Commander Sergeant Bill Preston traversed his turret toward a concrete emplacement that was raking the beach with machine gun fire. "High explosive, bunker front," he called to his loader. The shell impacted with a tremendous crash, sending concrete fragments flying. When the smoke cleared, the machine gun was silent, but the real battle was just beginning. Beyond the seawall lay the inundated marshlands that the Germans had flooded to create an impassable barrier. The only routes inland were for narrow causeways, raised roads that had to be seized before German reinforcements could counterattack. These causeways were the keys to the entire Utah beach operation. General Roosevelt, now commanding the assault from the beach itself, gathered his officers around him. His walking stick had been replaced by a rifle, and his uniform was soaked through, but his eyes were clear and determined. "Gentlemen, we have a beachhead. Now we need to expand it before Jerry recovers from his surprise." The sounds of battle echoed across the Norman countryside as American paratroopers, scattered throughout the peninsula since the early morning hours, fought to secure the inland objectives that would make the beach landing meaningful. The fate of Utah Beach and perhaps the entire invasion hung in the balance. By 0800 hours, the beach itself was secure, but the real battle lay ahead. For narrow causeways designated exits 1 through 4 stretched across the flooded marshland, like fingers reaching toward the interior of the Cotentin Peninsula. These raised roads, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles, represented the only routes through the deliberately inundated terrain that stretched for miles. Inland, Captain Robert Spears of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment had been fighting for these critical routes since before dawn. His paratroopers, scattered by high winds during their midnight drop, had regrouped in the darkness and were now engaged in desperate fighting around Causeway 2. The Germans had anticipated this moment, positioning anti-tank guns and machine gun nests to sweep the narrow approaches. With deadly crossfire, "They've got us zeroed in," Spears reported over his radio to Colonel Robert Sink. The static-filled transmission crackled through the early morning air as German mortar shells whistled overhead. "Every time we try to advance, they cut us down. We need armor support, and we need it now." On the beach, General Roosevelt had reached the same conclusion. The 4th Infantry Division had established their beachhead, but without access to the causeways. They would remain trapped on a narrow strip of sand. German reserves were already moving to seal off the landing. Radio intercepts indicated that the 91st Infantry Division was repositioning from the Cherbourg area, while elements of the 6th Parachute Regiment were moving to reinforce the causeway defenses. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, received orders to force Causeway 1. His Sherman tanks formed up in single file. The narrow roadway allowed no other formation. Behind them came infantry of the 1st Battalion, 8th Infantry Regiment, using the tanks as mobile shields against the machine gun fire that swept the raised roadway. Joseph Bolkowski's comprehensive study Utah Beach, the amphibious landing and airborne operations. On D-Day documents how the Causeway battles became the pivotal phase of the Utah Beach operation, determining whether the landing would succeed or fail. The lead Sherman, commanded by Staff Sergeant Robert Early, approached the first German roadblock at 09:15 hours. A massive concrete dragon's tooth barrier blocked the causeway, flanked by carefully positioned Panzerfaust positions. Early's gunner, Corporal Michael Torres, had a clear shot at the anti-tank gun that covered the approach. Armor-piercing anti-tank gun, 11 o'clock, Early called out. The 75mm gun spoke with authority, and the German position disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris. But immediately, Panzerfaust rockets began streaking toward the exposed Sherman. One rocket struck the tank's right track, immobilizing it on a narrow causeway. Behind the disabled tank, the infantry advanced ground to a halt. Private First Class Daniel Webster pressed himself against the causeway's raised edge as machine gun bullets cracked overhead. The Germans had turned the roadway into a killing ground, with interlocking fields of fire that covered every inch of the approach. Major General Raymond Barton, commanding the 4th Infantry Division, understood that time was running out. Each hour of delay gave the Germans more opportunity to reinforce their positions and launch a coordinated counterattack. From his command post just behind the seawall, he could see the smoke rising from battles all across the Cotentin Peninsula as scattered paratroopers fought to hold their objectives. The solution came from an unexpected source. Technical Sergeant Harrison Summers, a quiet soldier from West Virginia, took it upon himself to clear Causeway 1. Armed with only his rifle and a handful of grenades, Summers began a systematic assault on the German positions. Moving from bunker to bunker, he eliminated machine gun nests and sniper positions with methodical precision. Summers' lone wolf assault inspired the stalled infantry. One by one, other soldiers joined him, and the Causeway battle transformed from a standoff into a rolling advance. By 1000 hours, American forces had broken through the first line of German defenses and were pushing into the flooded interior. But the Germans were not finished. Major General Wilhelm Falley's 91st Infantry Division was moving to launch a counterattack that could drive the Americans back into the sea. The race for the Cotentin Peninsula had begun, and the outcome would determine the fate of Operation Overlord itself. The German counterattack came with methodical Prussian precision at 1100 hours. Oberst Gunther Kiel's battle group, consisting of 2 battalions from the 91st Infantry Division and a company of assault guns from the 709th Tank Destroyer Battalion, advanced through the Bocage country toward the American beachhead. Their objective was simple: drive the invaders back into the English Channel before they could consolidate their foothold. Major General Wilhelm Falley himself had been killed earlier that morning. His staff car shot up by American paratroopers near Picaville, but his division continued to execute his final orders. The Germans moved through the maze of hedgerows that characterized Norman farmland, using the ancient field boundaries as natural fortifications. Each hedgerow was 6 feet high and thick enough to stop tank shells, creating thousands of ready-made defensive positions. At Causeway 3, Captain Anthony McAuliffe's paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division could hear the German armor approaching through the morning mist. The distinctive rumble of tracked vehicles echoed across the marshland as Skirmish's 3rd assault guns maneuvered into firing positions. These low-slung tank destroyers, armed with 75mm guns, were specifically designed for defensive warfare. "Here they come," whispered Private Robert Wynn, peering through his rifle scope at the hedgerow to 100 yards away. The young soldier from Oklahoma had been fighting since 3 in the morning, when his parachute had deposited him in a farmer's field 5 miles from his intended drop zone. Now, exhausted and running low on ammunition, he prepared for what might be his final battle. The assault began with a devastating artillery barrage. German 105mm howitzers, positioned in carefully surveyed firing positions, dropped shells with surgical precision on the American positions. The paratroopers, caught in open ground around the Causeway exit, could only press themselves into whatever cover they could find and pray. According to the detailed account in Max Hastings' Overlord, D-Day, and the Battle for Normandy, the German counterattacks on June 6th were hampered by light air superiority and the confusion caused by the scattered airborne drops. But they remained dangerous threats to the newly established beachheads. Staff Sergeant William Tucker led his squad in a desperate defense of a stone farmhouse that commanded the approach to Causeway 3. The building's thick Norman walls provided some protection against small arms fire, but the German assault guns could reduce it to rubble with a few well-placed shots. Tucker distributed his remaining ammunition. Each man had less than 20 rounds left. The German infantry advanced in classic formation, assault guns providing covering fire, while riflemen moved from hedgerow to hedgerow. Unteroffizier Heinrich Müller's assault gun crew had been fighting Americans since Sicily, and they knew their business. Müller's gunner, Obergefreiter Klaus Weber, had already destroyed two American positions with high explosive shells, range for 100 meters, infantry in the open. Weber reported as he tracked a group of paratroopers attempting to cross between hedgerows. The assault gun's main weapon fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the battlefield. The shell burst among the Americans, sending them diving for cover. But the German attack began to lose momentum as it encountered the maze of individual battles that characterized airborne operations. Unlike conventional infantry, paratroopers were trained to fight as small, independent units, a squad, each team. Each individual soldier became a separate point of resistance that had to be eliminated before the advance could continue. At the beach itself, General Roosevelt coordinated the defense with characteristic energy. Despite his age and physical limitations, he moved from unit to unit, encouraging his men and personally directing artillery fire. The USS Nevada, still offshore, provided devastating naval gunfire support, its 14-inch shells creating massive craters in the German assembly areas. By noon, the German counterattack had stalled in the face of determined American resistance and overwhelming Allied firepower. The Luftwaffe was conspicuously absent. Allied fighters controlled the skies over Normandy completely. German commanders found themselves fighting a 20th century battle with 19th century tact. ICS, unable to concentrate their forces without suffering devastating air attacks, the tide was turning. But the battle for Utah Beach was far from over. The Norman hedgerows became a labyrinth of individual heroism as the afternoon of June 6th wore on. Each field, each farmhouse, each country lane became a separate battlefield where small groups of Americans fought desperate actions against German defenders who knew every stone, every gate, every hidden approach in their native countryside. Technical Sergeant John Robert Powers of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment found himself commanding a mixed group of paratroopers from 3 different units. Scattered by the chaotic nighttime drop, these men had never served together before, but the bonds forged in combat created instant brotherhood. Powers, a former coal miner from Pennsylvania, led them through the bocage with the steady determination that had carried him through the mines of Appalachia. "Jerry's got a machine gun nest in that farmhouse," Powers whispered to his makeshift squad as they crouched behind a stone wall, thick with centuries of Norman ivy. The German MG-40 had already cut down to American patrols, attempting to advance along the country road. Its position commanded the intersection that led to St. Mary-Église, the critical town that dominated the inland approaches to Utah Beach. Private First Class Donald Burgett, barely 19 years old and fighting in his first battle, volunteered for the most dangerous job. "I can get around behind them through that orchard," he suggested, pointing to a grove of apple trees whose blossoms had been shredded by machine gun fire. The young soldier from Detroit had been terrified during the flight across the English Channel, but now, in the heat of battle, he felt only a strange calm. The plan was elegantly simple. Powers would create a diversion by engaging the machine gun position from the front, while Burgett worked his way through the orchard to attack from the rear. It was the kind of small unit tactic that American paratroopers had perfected through months of intensive training, but executing it under fire required courage that no training could provide. Meanwhile, at the coastal strongpoint of La Madeleine, Captain George Mabry led Company G of the 8th Infantry Regiment in a textbook assault on a German bunker complex. The concrete positions had withstood the naval bombardment, and their 75mm guns commanded the southern approaches to Utah Beach. If these positions weren't eliminated, they could interdict American reinforcements and supplies throughout the critical first day. SLA, Marshall's authoritative combat study Night Drop. The American airborne invasion of Normandy provides detailed accounts of the small unit actions that characterized the fighting inland from Utah Beach, showing how individual initiative often determined the outcome of larger operations. Mabry's approach relied on careful coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery. A Sherman tank from the 701st Tank Battalion provided covering fire, while his riflemen worked their way closer to the bunker. The tank's 75mm gun couldn't penetrate the thick concrete walls, but it could suppress the German defenders and prevent them from bringing effective fire to bear on the advancing infantry. Sergeant First Class Curtis Cullen had modified his tank with steel prongs, welded to the front-end improvised device that allowed Sherman tanks to punch through the Norman hedgerows. that had stymied earlier advances. His innovation, born from combat necessity, would later be adopted throughout the American forces in Normandy. Cohen's tank smashed through the hedgerow, screening the German bunker, catching the defenders by surprise. The close-quarters fighting that followed epitomized the brutality of infantry combat. German defenders, trapped in their concrete bunkers, fought with the desperation of men who knew no quarter would be given or expected. By 1500 hours, the German defensive positions around Utah Beach had been systematically eliminated by dozens of such small unit actions. Each success was won at the cost of American blood, but together they created the secure perimeter that would allow the massive buildup of Allied forces in the days to come. As evening approached, the sounds of battle began to diminish. The critical first day was nearly over, and Utah Beach remained firmly in American hands. But the real test lay ahead, consolidating the beachhead and preparing for the breakout that would liberate France. As the sun began to set over the Norman coast on June 6, 1944, the character of the battle at Utah Beach transformed from desperate assault to methodical consolidation. The immediate crisis had passed. American forces held a secure beachhead, stretching for miles along the coast and extending up to 3 miles inland. But General Omar Bradley, commanding the First Army from his headquarters ship offshore, knew that the real work was just beginning. The logistics of invasion required a precisely choreographed ballet of ships, landing craft, and shore parties. By 1600 hours, LST's landing ship, tank were beaching themselves on the receding tide, their massive outdoors opening to disgorge Sherman tanks, artillery pieces, and the thousands of tons of supplies that would sustain the American advance. Each LST carried up to 20 tanks or 40 trucks, along with nearly 400 tons of ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies. Colonel James Van Fleet, commanding the 8th Infantry Regiment, established his command post in a Norman farmhouse whose thick stone walls had provided shelter for centuries of farmers, and now offered protection from German artillery fire. Maps covered every surface as staff officers coordinated the complex task of transforming a beach assault into a sustainable military operation. "We need those beach exits cleared and reinforced," Van Fleet instructed his operations officer, Major Robert York. "Engineering priorities are road repair, mine clearance, and establishing ammunition dumps. We're expecting the German 7th Army to launch a major counterattack within 48 hours." The mention of enemy reinforcements was well-founded. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Army Group B was rushing reserves toward Normandy, including the formidable 21st Panzer Division and elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth. These veteran formations, equipped with Tiger and Panther tanks, represented the Wehrmacht's mobile reserve for defending Western Europe. Private First Class Eugene Rowe, a medic with the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, worked tirelessly in an aid station established in St. Mary-Eglis's ancient church. The building's medieval stones, which had witnessed centuries of Norman history, now sheltered wounded American paratroopers. Rowe moved among the casualties with quiet efficiency, his medical training put to the ultimate test in conditions no field manual could adequately describe. According to the comprehensive analysis in Rick Atkinson's The Guns at Last Light, the success of Utah Beach depended not just on the initial assault, but on the rapid establishment of logistical infrastructure that could support sustained operations against German counterattacks. The German response, when it came, proved fragmented and uncoordinated. Hitler's insistence on personal control of armored reserves had delayed the deployment of panzer divisions for crucial hours. By the time German commanders received permission to commit their mobile forces, American positions had been strengthened by the arrival of additional infantry, armor, and artillery. Colonel Russell Red Reeder, despite being wounded by mortar fire earlier in the day, continued to coordinate defensive preparations around the beachhead perimeter. His 12th Infantry Regiment had borne the brunt of German counterattacks throughout the afternoon, but the line had held. Now, as evening approached, Reeder's men were digging in for what promised to be a long night.